Mr. Deputy Speaker, and can I say it is a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for New Forest East. He and I have parsed the course on this issue and the myriad of alternatives within legacy over many years. And I served on the committee with him in the 1617 inquiry and the latter inquiry, which published around 2018. We don't agree, and I'm not sure that was a fair synopsis of the four academics in total. But I will come back to this issue in my contribution, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Before I do move on, can I just say that I think the contribution from the Right Honourable Member for Skipton and Ripon was the most powerful contribution that we are likely to hear this afternoon. I think it was motivated not out of prejudice or political aspiration for one hue or another, but solely from his emotionally charged and personal experience in Northern Ireland. I think it was rooted very much in principle, and I thank him very much for the contribution that he has made. When I think back to one of the debates we had in Westminster Hall around proposals for legacy, and I was reading some of the Hansard contributions this morning, I recalled an interview that I heard on the morning of that debate that day. And Alan McBride, a victims campaigner and a victim himself from Northern Ireland, was on the radio that morning. And he was talking about a day of reflection in Northern Ireland and Belfast for victims. And he said, when we were thinking of a day of reflection in Belfast, we tried to find one day, one date, where nobody died. And they couldn't find one. They could not find a single day in the calendar that somebody had not been killed in Northern Ireland. No date which was not attached to a victim. And they chose the 21st of June as summer solstice, because that day heralds a new dawn, that day heralds a new season, that day heralds warmth and aspiration. And when I think of our party's approach, and in fairness the majority of parties from Northern Ireland's approach to the issue of legacies, we can't detach ourselves easily from victims, or their experiences, or their hurt, or the lingering fears and doubts that pervade our society. We can't do that. And I know it is easier for others in this chamber to take a more singular view, a singular constituency-based view, a single veterans view. It is easier to do that. We can't do that. The principle we have applied throughout the myriad of decades of consideration around legacy has been one that keeps open the hope of justice, no matter how easily those contributing this afternoon have tried to detach us from it, to keep open the pursuit of justice. That this state recognises that what happened to their loved ones was wrong, and that natural justice and the rule of law in this country still matters, still counts, and should still run through our system. That is something that we have attached to every proposal that has been brought before us. Secondly, and I don't attach this to other parties, we have never wanted to see an equivalence between people who either lived innocent, peaceful and wholesome lives and were cut down in their prime as a result of terrorists, or those who stepped forward and stepped up to protect all of us, to give us the freedom that we can stand in this chamber and political chambers throughout Northern Ireland and stand up for what's right and what's true. No equivalence between those brave women and men and those who went out to destroy and wreak havoc in our society. And I'm afraid on those two principles this bill fails. And I take no joy in saying that. I know there are members in this chamber that think, for goodness sake, Northern Ireland legacy again, can't they just agree? Well, we all do agree in Northern Ireland that this bill is wrong. That this bill will not command support. That this bill drives a coach and horses through the pursuit of justice. And I take no pride in that, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We've been through discussions around the statute of limitations, and I chided the Right Honourable Member earlier about his revisionism perhaps his fair rehearsal of the approach from the 4 academics before us, and I do say it fondly because I have huge admiration for him. He is right to say, and the academics were right to say, that should anything be brought forward, principled, detailed as a statute of limitations, it would have to apply equally. But the landscape in Northern Ireland is not equal. We always advance the argument that nobody who broke the law can escape the law, nobody who deserves justice should evade justice. But for those who served our state, for those who put on the brave uniform of our armed forces or the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the UDR and other organisations, for those who did that and were involved in incidents that led to a killing, there will have been an investigation. And we know that post-1973, those investigations were Article 2 compliant. And we've always advanced the argument that where our state can demonstrate that it has discharged its duty, then you should be able to move on. No re-investigations, no trauma, no fear of that knocked door because the state has done what is required of it under the European Convention of Human Rights. And for whatever reason, there were too few within their system of government that wanted to embrace that argument. And I say the situation and the landscape was uneven in Northern Ireland because where the state was involved, an investigation duly followed. When the state wasn't involved, I'm afraid there are far too many deaths in Northern Ireland for which there was no investigation. And that's how that principle could have been applied. 2 years has been mentioned. Good Friday Agreement, early release of prisoners, and the maximum sentence of 2 years. It's been bandied about today as that's just the way it is. That was proposed by the Labour government, that was passed by a referendum in Northern Ireland, that was ultimately put through this chamber. I'm not going to be shy in saying I found it obtuse and offensive then, and I find it offensive to this day. 2 years. That's all. If you've served it, out you go. It's not justice. There were no cheerleaders for that proposal in Northern Ireland. There were some accepted it as a compromise as part of the Good Friday Agreement. There are others who didn't. How many times have we heard in this debate this afternoon, 2 years isn't what we're talking about here? Read Schedule 11 of this bill and it still won't tell you that this bill will remove those provisions. Not 2 years in jail. Nothing. No jail time whatsoever. Whether you engage in this process and you seek immunity from prosecution and you tell the truth, or you don't. If you sit outside the system, if you offer no answers for relatives of victims and their loved ones, if you decide that this process in this bill is not for you, it doesn't matter because the British government in this Parliament are seeking our support for legislation that reduces your time in jail to nothing. Who could be proud of that proposal? Read Schedule 11, it doesn't even spell it out. It doesn't even spell it out, but that's the ramifications of this bill. Engage, don't engage. It doesn't matter. You'll serve no time.
Will the honourable member?
Certainly.
I think my honourable friend, Mr Deputy Speaker, is making a very powerful point. And does he agree with me that these provisions are not just something remote in the sense that they apply only to incidents that occurred in Northern Ireland, but in fact the provisions of the Sentences Act apply to terrorist incidents that occurred in Great Britain and elsewhere, and include the murder of British citizens in this city, in Birmingham and Manchester, and indeed in many of the constituencies represented by honourable and right honourable members opposite. And they need to understand that this injustice does not just apply to the people we represent. It applies to every single family in this United Kingdom whose loved ones were cut down in cold blood by terrorists, and that capacity in this country remains to this day.
I agree absolutely, and I hope that the point is not lost. no time, no intended time, no consequence. With no consequence for not engaging in this process, there's no inducement to engage in it. I heard the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green, who again I think has been fair in his contributions on this legacy issue over many years, ask the question, well, what is it people want? Do they want time served in jail, or do they want answers? There isn't a singular answer to that question. There are many victims, and it's said in here, people just want to know the truth. There are victims up and down the length and breadth of Northern Ireland who know exactly who killed their loved one and who see the perpetrator walking freely through their town on a daily or weekly basis. And as they walk that lonely path to the graveside to see their loved one, the person they know responsible for the death of their loved one walks free through the streets with their family. But that person still walks, and there hasn't been an effective investigation. To bring it into this House, how often do members walk through those double doors? And how often do they look at the plaques right above? There's commonality between each of those three plaques. Each gentleman stood for election to this House. Each gentleman believed in democracy and the rule of law. Each gentleman was murdered by terrorists related to the Northern Ireland Troubles. The Reverend Robert Bradford was murdered in his constituency surgery in South Belfast by the IRA. Ari Nave was murdered in his car with an under-car booby-trap bomb by the INLA in 1979. And Ian Gow, 1981, murdered by the IRA again with an under-car booby-trap bomb. Colleagues of ours, predecessors of ours, people who stood up for democracy in this country but were cut down in their prime. And what else connects them? Nobody has been made available or amenable for those crimes. The perpetrators have evaded justice. Of course, Gavin.
Again, Mr. Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend makes a powerful point. And is he aware that the chief suspect in the murder of Ari Neve in the precincts of this House is currently operating a bar in Spain, has eluded justice, and under the provisions of this bill will never have justice served upon him?
That's exactly why, and I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, it's exactly why I raise these issues. I want members to know that this isn't just about cold cases that have never got a prospect of success in the courts. There are people out there today guilty of the most heinous crimes during the Northern Ireland Troubles against our state, against our citizens, against our neighbours, across the communities in Northern Ireland and right throughout Great Britain. And they have evaded justice. They have fought extradition. They have squirreled themselves off in the Irish Republic and under the political offence exemption stayed there. And some of them live in the United States of America, and our government has sought extradition of these individuals because they know they are responsible and they want to bring them to justice, and yet they stay in their safe havens. And some freely walk the streets of Northern Ireland in exactly the same position. Those perpetrators of violence, be they Republican or Loyalist, will be able to sleep soundly in their beds once this bill is passed. They will know they never have to spend a day in jail. They will know that the focus will be on those state cases for which there is information that will naturally run through the information recovery process. They won't engage in this, and there is no consequence for them not doing so. I say it with as much respect as I can in the circumstances that the idea that our government, that this Parliament is going to pass legislation that allows the perpetrators of violence who have evaded justice to retire in dignity is a disgrace. It is a disgrace, and retire they will. This Parliament has considered on the runs legislation where our government, at a request from Republicans, was going to pass legislation to say those that were on the run and evading justice could come home and get away scot-free. It was going to be passed by the Labour government until Sinn Féin realised it would apply to soldiers as well, and they pulled their support. And then after the On the Runs legislation, we had the letters of comfort. And I'm glad the Secretary of State did rule out the application of letters of comfort applying today. But John Downey walked free from court as a result of letters of comfort. They weren't issued by the Conservative government, it just came to light after 2010. But John Downey was responsible for the Hyde Park bombing, killed 11 service personnel and 7 horses that were working alongside them. And when he stood in the Old Bailey, he produced a letter that said, "You're not currently or actively sought for investigation." So this Parliament has a history of bidding for the wrong people, in my view. And our view will always be based on those who have suffered the most in Northern Ireland. And I do want to say to the Government, and I'm sure they've got the impression that we're not going to be with you on second reading on this bill, but these issues are far too important for us to say we can't have any part of it and therefore not engage. I want the Government to hear us loudly and clearly that we will be bringing forward amendments, and we will seek as much cross-party and cross-community support for those amendments as possible. And if we do that in a spirit of goodwill and cooperation, then I do hope the Government will engage in these thoughtful considerations about sentencing, about time served, because getting a conviction and being out on a licence and having all the freedoms you enjoy and your victims don't just simply isn't sufficient. On the ability of people who have actively evaded justice, who the Government have sought through extradition proceedings to come home and retire with dignity, we need to rule that out. And I do hope we'll get a willing ear. Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thank you.